In June 1995 at 3:45 a.m., a 34-year-old mother and her 11-year-old daughter, Lacey, were reported missing by their family. Unbeknownst to them, a serial killer was prowling the area, successfully eluding capture. A police officer, examining the mother's office and documenting the scene with photographs, discovered Lacey. She was tied to a chair, her head bowed and seemingly lifeless. However, while taking another photograph, something unexpected happened.
When I started to take the photograph, she kind of turned and looked up at me. It's kind of like seeing someone rise from the dead.
I woke up, I heard, and I thought, is there someone taking pictures? And I turned my head. And when I did, I heard a man say, "This one's alive."
The enigma surrounding Lacey, her mother, and the other victims of this serial killer lingered unresolved until the little girl in the photograph was found alive. Her survival offered a glimmer of hope and a crucial lead in unraveling the truth. Mary Phillips was born in 1961 in Bradford, a small town in Arkansas. During her high school years, she met James Phillips, her lifelong love. They started dating at that time and eventually married. Mary became a devoted wife and mother to 3 children. Their first child, Darla, was born in 1979, followed by Jessie 2 years later, and their youngest daughter, Lacey, was born in 1984. The Phillips family spent several years living in Hope before moving in 1990 to the quaint town of Bald Knob, also in Arkansas. Mary was known for her deep religious beliefs and was regarded by those who knew her as a wonderful person with a radiant smile that could light up any room. Professionally, Mary trained as an accountant and worked at a tax office. In her free time, she enjoyed spending time with her family, gardening, and engaging in outdoor activities. On June 6, 1995, at the age of 34, Mary went to work as usual while her husband was away on a business trip. That afternoon, Darla dropped off her younger sister Lacey, who was 11 at the time, at their mother's office since Mary was supposed to take Lacey to a dentist appointment after work. Darla then left to attend a friend's birthday party, kissing her mother goodbye and telling her she loved her. Later that evening, Jesse, the Phillips' second child, grew worried when neither his mother nor Lacey had returned home. He called his father, who was out of town. James instructed his son to check if Mary had been in an accident nearby. Jesse followed his father's advice but could not find her. James then asked Jesse to stay at home, believing Mary might return at any moment. As the night progressed and there was still no sign of Mary and Lacey, James's concern grew, leading him to contact the police to report his wife and daughter missing since 3 p.m. the previous day. Upon receiving the report, 3 police officers went to Mary's workplace. In the parking lot, they found a lone truck parked beside the building, which was registered to Mary. One of the officers entered the office and discovered Mary dead, with her hands bound behind her back and naked from the waist down. The officer immediately alerted his colleagues, who began their investigation by noticing drag marks leading to the bathroom door. Upon opening it, they found Lacey tied to a chair and brutally beaten. The officers initially believed the girl might have also died due to her severe condition. A detective who was photographing the crime scene captured an image with a flash where Lacey was lying. To his astonishment, Lacey turned her head and looked directly at him. Her brown hair, matted and darkened by blood, covered the right side of her face. Despite her grave injuries, Lacey had survived for about 10 hours tied up. She asked about her mother, and the detective could only reassure her to stay calm and try to rest until the ambulance arrived. He was struck by the child's bravery. Lacey had to pass by her mother's body to leave the office and was urgently taken to a nearby hospital for treatment. She had severe head injuries that required surgery and a stay in the intensive care unit. Meanwhile, the police contacted James, urging him to return home immediately. He packed his bags and drove back, unaware of the details of the situation. Once Lacey's condition stabilized, she was able to describe her attacker, providing details about his appearance, clothing, hairstyle, and tattoos, one on his arm and another resembling a tear under his left eye. Her description was crucial in helping the police identify the suspect as Jack Johnson Jr., a man known to them due to multiple previous arrests for burglary, theft, and drug use. Detectives then went to question him. A state police investigator interviewed Jack, who was 30 years old at the time. Surprisingly, Jack confessed to the crime without any pressure, detailing his actions. At one point, he even mentioned that if he could, he would take the investigator's gun and end his life right there. His demeanor during the interrogation and the chilling details he provided about the attack made it evident to the officers that Jack had acted with absolute cold-bloodedness. Jack claimed that his actions were motivated by revenge and anger because his wife had been sexually assaulted and the police had not thoroughly investigated the incident. However, there is no precise information about when or to whom Jack was married, nor about the incident he referred to. According to the detective's investigation, on that fateful day, June 6, 1995, Jack saw Mary enter the building where she worked while he was painting a sign nearby. Later, when Lacey was already in the office with her mother, he decided to enter. Some sources say he used the excuse of looking for a job, while others claim he asked to borrow some accounting books, after which he left. However, he returned that same day with a gun, latex gloves, and wire. Jack forced Mary to lie face down on the floor and made Lacey do the same on top of her mother before robbing the cash register. He then tied their hands with wire and took Lacey to a bathroom, where he strapped her to a chair. The little girl pleaded with him not to hurt her mother, to which he responded by saying he would harm her instead. He then struck Lacey at least 8 times on the head with the gun, causing her to lose consciousness. Jack returned to the room where Mary was, struck her on the head, and sexually assaulted her. Mary fought back with all her might, but Jack overpowered her by strangling her with his hands. He then wrapped the coffee maker's electrical cord around her body until she stopped breathing. Meanwhile, Lacey regained consciousness and, realizing she was injured, began calling out for her mother. Jack went back to the bathroom and choked Lacey until she passed out again. She was gravely injured with multiple fractures and barely clinging to life. Believing the child had died, Jack left her in the small room and fled the scene. But who was this man capable of committing such a heinous act? Jack was born on August 10, 1964, in Toledo, Ohio. His father was an alcoholic and his mother had gambling problems. Jack was one of 7 siblings but had a particularly close relationship with the youngest, who was a year and a half younger than him. Jack suffered a high fever and seizures when he was just a year old. He was later diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, and at the age of 5, he began taking Ritalin as part of his treatment. Around this time, he also started experiencing hallucinations. It was also revealed that Jack suffered physical and sexual abuse as a child and was said to exhibit two personalities. On one hand, he could be a loving and affectionate child who enjoyed drawing and telling stories. On the other hand, he could become filled with rage and react violently, often lashing out at family members. As he grew older, Jack began acting violently towards animals, killing several of them. He also got into numerous troubles with the police and was eventually placed in a juvenile detention center. There, he was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, antisocial behavior, and a tendency to bang his head against cabinets. At a young age, Jack became addicted to alcohol and other drugs, seemingly as a way to escape the pain he had endured. This cocktail of abuse, illness, and substance use made Jack a man unable to control his life. Physically, Jack was distinguished by a series of tattoos, including hearts and barbed wire on his arms and wrists. In 1985, Jack had a daughter with a woman whose details remain unknown. The child was put up for adoption and raised in Toledo by a family that provided her with a comfortable and protected life. Jack was a tormented man who attempted suicide twice, once in 1989 and again in 1991 when he jumped off a bridge. In 1995, he voluntarily admitted himself to a mental health center, reporting suicidal thoughts. After evaluation, experts diagnosed him with bipolar disorder. According to case reviews, he used methamphetamines to cope with this mental illness, which causes extreme mood swings, from euphoria and irritability to depression. These changes can affect sleep, energy, activity levels, judgment, behavior, and clarity of thought. Bipolar disorder is a lifelong condition that can be managed with treatment, typically involving medication and psychological support. After seeking help at the mentioned institution, Jack left after 6 days, although the circumstances of his departure are unclear. 6 months after his brief stay at the mental health center, Jack committed the horrific attack that took the life of a loving mother and left 3 children motherless, and James without the love of his life. A few days after Jack's arrest, a preliminary hearing was held at the county circuit court. During Jack's trial, the district attorney sought the death penalty, arguing that Jack was a dangerous man likely to commit another violent crime. Reports indicated that during one of the hearings, Jack himself asked to be executed immediately. One of the key witnesses, Investigator Howard, recounted Jack's detailed confession of the crime. Additionally, evidence was presented, including the photograph taken of Lacey at the crime scene when officers initially believed she had died from the beating Jack inflicted. Another significant moment was when Lacey, who had survived the attack, took the witness stand and identified Jack as the perpetrator. Jack pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, expressing deep remorse for his actions and stating that he was haunted by the ghosts of his victims. He claimed he could not forgive himself and would willingly give up his life if it could undo the harm he caused. On April 17, 1996, the jury delivered its verdict. Jack was found guilty. He was sentenced to death for murdering Mary Phillips, received a life sentence for sexually assaulting her, and an additional 30 years for the attempted murder of Lacey Phillips, along with a $15,000 fine. In the years following, Jack's defense team filed numerous appeals against his conviction, focusing on mitigating evidence and the legality of Arkansas's death penalty laws. The attorneys argued that they were not allowed to present critical evidence to the jury that could have mitigated the sentence, such as reports confirming his bipolar disorder and constant hallucinations. They also pointed out that only $6,400 had been spent on his defense, whereas a comprehensive investigation would typically cost tens of thousands of dollars. Additionally, they relied on an expert who was later deemed incompetent by the state medical board. Meanwhile, the Phillips family struggled to adjust to life without Mary. Darla took on the role of an improvised mother, cleaning the house, preparing meals, and taking care of Lacey and Jesse. While awaiting execution on Arkansas's death row, Jack's genetic profile was entered into the National DNA Database. This eventually led to the revelation of dark secrets from his past. In 2002, a detective reopened the case of Lorraine Ann Barrett, a 32-year-old woman from Bridgeville, Pennsylvania, who was murdered in June 1991. Lorraine, known as Laurie, graduated in 1977 from South Fayette High School and worked as a customer service representative for a telephone company in Washington, Pennsylvania. She was on vacation in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, when she met her assailant at a bar where she was last seen. Witnesses reported that a man with multiple tattoos accompanied her to her room at the Days Inn Lauderdale South Motel. Once in the room, the man beat her, assaulted her, and strangled her to death before fleeing. In the early hours of June 1, 1991, a maintenance worker found Laurie's body in her hotel room. The police were immediately notified, and an investigation began to identify the attacker. Authorities created a composite sketch of the suspect, describing a man with several tattoos, including barbed wire and hearts with names. This information was distributed throughout the county. When Jack's sister saw the description and sketch of the man wanted for the murder of a woman, she immediately thought it resembled her brother. Although she didn't believe Jack was guilty and thought it was a case of mistaken identity, she still told their father. He advised her not to tell their mother. Subsequently, their father put Jack on a bus to Arkansas. Despite their efforts, the police could not locate the culprit, and the case quickly went cold. 12 years after Laurie's death, the case was reopened. The detectives sent fluid samples collected from Laurie's body and the crime scene to be compared with databases that hadn't existed when the crime occurred. The following year, the system found a match with Jack's DNA archived in Arkansas. Based on this result, a second test was conducted at the State Forensic Laboratory, conclusively proving that Jack had committed the crime against Laurie. It was also determined that his tattoos and features matched those of the suspect who had murdered the tourist in Fort Lauderdale. Florida authorities then issued an extradition order for Jack, who was at that time in maximum security prison in Arkansas, appealing his sentence for the third time after being condemned to death. Jack would now face justice again on charges of first-degree murder and sexual assault in Broward County. Once in Fort Lauderdale, Jack met the detective who was handling Laurie's case. To the detective, it was evident that Jack was a serial killer. He earned Jack's trust, leading to Jack's confession that he had killed another person in Broward County. Although Jack didn't provide the victim's name, he promised that he would reveal his secret someday. A similar situation occurred between Jack and his sister during one of her prison visits. She asked if there were other victims, and he admitted there was one more but didn't give any details, promising to explain everything in a letter when the time came. For Laurie's family, discovering after so long who had taken her life was both a shock and a relief. Her sister stated that it was the news she had always wanted to hear, but learning about it this way was overwhelming because it was so unexpected. Finally, in 2005, Jack was tried for Laurie's murder. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was then returned to Arkansas to await his execution. A couple of years later, Jack's defense continued to seek clemency. His lawyer argued in a hearing that the jury forms in Jack's trial contained contradictory information and pointed out that such ambiguities were typically resolved with new sentencing hearings ordered by the Supreme Court. He also argued that Jack's bipolar disorder had not been adequately presented to the jury, explaining that while it didn't excuse his actions, it did offer an explanation. Despite the clemency hearings not succeeding, Jack's execution was postponed multiple times over the years. Among other reasons, this was due to various illnesses he suffered, including high blood pressure and diabetes, which eventually led to the amputation of his leg. In parallel, in 2010, Jack's biological daughter wanted to learn about her biological parents. She filed a petition with a probate court to disclose her birth certificate, which had her mother's contact information. She called her mother and discovered that her father was Jack, a man on death row in Arkansas. As a single mother of two, she struggled to process this reality. She was shocked, filled with guilt and confusion about the man who had fathered her, but also grateful for the family that had raised her. Feeling compelled to reach out, she wrote a letter to Jack in prison. Soon after, she began receiving boxes of Jack's writings and paintings he had made for her two young children. While she knew Jack deserved to be in prison for his crimes, she also felt that he had changed. Jack's execution was scheduled for November 14, 2015, but it was suspended due to legal challenges related to the drugs used in the execution procedures. In 2017, the state of Arkansas decided to resume executions, and among those scheduled was Jack. In April of that year, a new clemency hearing was held, but Jack refused to attend, opting instead to send a handwritten letter to the state parole board for his lawyer to read. In the letter, he expressed regret not only for his actions but also for the hearing itself, stating he was ready to face death at the hands of the state. He forgave his executioners, acknowledging someone had to carry out his sentence. Jack made it clear that he would reject any commutation from a death sentence to life imprisonment, as he refused to spend any more time in what he described as a rat hole prison. He felt he had no right to seek forgiveness and was tormented by his actions toward Mary and her daughter, attributing his crimes to years of mental illness, abuse, drugs, and poor decisions. Jack's lawyer highlighted his shame and remorse. During the hearing, Lacey, who by then was 32 years old and married, declared that she didn't want to live another day knowing Jack was still alive. She expressed frustration that more than 20 years after the incident, justice had yet to be served. For the Phillips family, the delays in Jack's execution had been a torturous journey, preventing closure for the horrors Mary and Lacey endured. After 21 years on death row, Jack prepared to face his sentence and declared himself ready to die. He gave his sister a letter written in 2006, instructing her to open it a year after his execution date. Jack's biological daughter traveled to Arkansas to see her father for the first and last time, the day before his execution. They held hands, tried to maintain a cheerful attitude, forgave each other for past hurts, and reminisced about her birth. Jack gave his daughter his wedding ring, which she now wears on a chain around her neck. On April 24, 2017, Jack consumed his last meal: fried chicken, potato wedges with tartar sauce, beef jerky, 3 candy bars, and a chocolate shake. Around 7 p.m., he gave a 2-minute final statement apologizing to Lacey, expressing disbelief at how he had hurt her, and professing his love for her as if she were his own daughter. He added that he hoped in time they could understand who he truly was and that he was not a monster. In a controversial statement, he implied there was a reason for the tragic events of that fateful day. He also left a written note stating that he aimed to become a better person in prison, practicing Buddhism and studying physics, and that no words could fully convey his remorse. At 52 years old, Jack was executed alongside another death row inmate, Marcel Williams, marking the first double execution in the United States in 17 years. His death was pronounced at 7 p.m., making him the 1,450th person executed in the U.S. since 1976. Mary's husband, James, lamented the long wait for justice, but felt relief at its eventual achievement. He also expressed sympathy for Jack's family during their ordeal. Jack's sister stated she felt pain for the victims and prayed for them constantly, acknowledging Jack needed to be punished for his unforgivable acts. However, she also remembered him as a loving child and wanted to be present at his execution to support him, though the Arkansas Department of Correction denied her request. A year after Jack's execution, his sister opened the letter he had given her. The 4-page letter, he confessed in detail to the murder of Regina Harrison, providing details only the killer would know. Jack wanted Regina's family to know the truth, claiming her spirit had visited and haunted him for 3 years until he confessed. He described Regina's initial anger and longing for her parents, but said she eventually understood him and forgave him, although he could never forgive himself. He expressed deep remorse and stated he could not rest in peace until Regina's family knew what had happened. Jack instructed his sister to send the letter to the police. In November 2018, she sent it to the Broward police, leading to Regina's body being exhumed and her DNA analyzed, tests that were not possible in the 1980s when the crime occurred. In February 2019, based on the DNA results, the Broward County prosecutor officially announced that Jack was responsible for Regina's death, a crime for which another man had been convicted. In truth, Regina was Jack's first victim, a crime he committed at the age of 18. Regina, a 20-year-old college student, was kind, sweet, and deeply religious, attending Palm Beach Atlantic College, a Christian school in West Palm Beach. On May 12, 1983, Regina left her parents' house for an evening bike ride in the North Beach neighborhood of Hollywood, Florida, but never returned home. Jack spotted her while she was cycling, approached her, and decided to head to the beach. As darkness fell, he kidnapped her, took her to Westlake Park, where he stripped her, assaulted her sexually, and strangled her to death, leaving her body abandoned in the park. The next day, friends and family found Regina's naked body in the woods. During the investigation, witnesses reported seeing Regina riding her bike with a slim, long-haired man on a black bicycle along a popular trail on Hollywood Beach. Authorities created a sketch of the suspect based on the description. For 5 months, there were no leads until Detective John Curcio, previously mentioned, saw a television program about the crime. He was part of the unit that captured Ronald Henry Stewart, a serial sexual assailant who had terrorized women in Florida and Mississippi in the late 1980s. Curcio realized that Ronald matched the suspect's sketch, slim, long-haired, and riding a black bicycle when arrested. A witness who had seen Regina and her alleged attacker at the beach identified Ronald as the man with Regina from a photo lineup. Additionally, an acquaintance of Ronald claimed he had confessed to killing a woman in the park. Soon, Ronald was charged with Regina's murder. Despite several factors suggesting Ronald's innocence, including non-matching fingerprints at the crime scene, he pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. He admitted to 3 counts of sexual assault with a deadly weapon in Broward County in exchange for prosecutors dropping charges in 6 other cases. Ronald was sentenced to 50 years in prison in January 1985, to be served concurrently with his other sentences for sexual offenses. He never regretted the plea deal nor claimed any coercion in accepting it. Ronald Henry Stewart served most of his time in Mississippi, but was transferred to Florida in 2007, where he died of cancer the following year. Jack's confession to Regina's murder proved Ronald had no connection to the case. Following this revelation, prosecutor Paula McMahon announced they would work to overturn Ronald's wrongful conviction and investigate Jack's past for other potential victims in Florida and across the U.S. The story of Mary, Lacey, and the Phillips family is a grim reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the most unexpected places. It is also a testament to courage and a demonstration that the pursuit of truth and justice must never waver, as they can emerge when least expected. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations. Good afternoon, dear audience. As you know, here at Unreal True Crime, we release videos every other day. Many of you have reached out expressing a desire for daily content, so we've launched a new channel also focused on real-life crime stories called The Crime Storyteller. On the days we don't post videos on Unreal True Crime, we'll upload them there. This means if you're looking for daily doses of the most astonishing real-life crime cases, don't hesitate to subscribe. Without further ado, let's dive into today's case. Erin was born on July 15, 1994, in the United States to unknown parents. Fortunately, she was adopted by Lore and William, a couple from Tennessee. They had 7 children in total, with 5 of them being adopted, including Erin. For Lore and William, adopting was more than a decision. It was about following a divine command to help those in need, especially since some of their adopted children had special needs. For instance, their youngest, Trisha, was born with multiple birth defects. From early childhood, while growing up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Erin showed a remarkable and unconditional love for animals. Her mother cherished memories of Erin being the only one who could make a rabbit walk on a leash as if it were a dog. Kind-hearted and gentle, Erin enjoyed the benefits of having a loving and united family, facing only the usual challenges of any average household. When Trisha passed away at just 3.5 years old, Lore and William helped their grieving children understand the importance of having provided a happy life for her. Over time, Erin turned her affinity for animals into a special talent for taming horses that no one else could tame. She had a pony named Riley at a stable near her home. In 5th grade, she met Jonathan Corwin, a boy a year older than her. Initially, they were not particularly close, but about 5 years later, they started chatting on social media. By then, Erin's protective nature had led her to become the mother of dozens of animals, ranging from fish and guinea pigs to dogs and cats, all of whom she welcomed and cared for. Eventually, Jonathan plucked up the courage to ask her out, choosing her 16th birthday for the date. With her parents' permission, their love blossomed. Their romance, full of poem exchanges and shared dreams, turned them into the quintessential American couple. After finishing high school, Erin found employment at a local tractor supply company, spending her free time with her horse or scouring garage sales with her mother and siblings. Meanwhile, Jonathan joined the Marine Infantry, and without hesitation about their bright future, they married in Las Vegas in November 2012. The following year, Jonathan learned he would be transferred to California. While the prospect excited both him and Erin, they planned to return to East Tennessee as soon as possible. In September 2013, the newlyweds moved to their new home at the Marine Base in San Bernardino County. In turn, the location served as one of the entry points to Joshua Tree National Park. Here, they met new people, such as the couple Connor and Aisling Maliki, who lived with their young son Brian on the ground floor of the same block as Erin and her husband. Amid daily tasks, Jonathan also struck up a friendship with another colleague, Christopher Brandon Lee. Son of Karen Lee and hailing from Anchorage, Alaska, Christopher was a Marine who had been going through tough times after returning from a tour in Afghanistan. He lived on the base with his wife Nicole and their 6-year-old daughter Liberty. Like Erin, the couple shared a love for horses. Soon, the three couples became friends. While their husbands were on duty, Erin, Aisling, and Nicole would visit each other to have lunch and chat. When Jonathan, Connor, and Christopher were at home, they would cook or watch movies and TV shows in any of their apartments. It seemed like each home was everyone's home. Additionally, Christopher and his wife Nicole became horse sponsors at the Roca Blanca Ranch, which also hosted a non-profit organization dedicated to animal care and protection. Isabel Megley owned the site. Naturally, upon learning about it, Erin joined the initiative. Amid their military duties, everything seemed to go smoothly. Initially, Christopher seemed to fit well with the uniform, but over time, other Marines noticed he often displayed a mix of disorder and insolence in handling weapons. An officer later reprimanded him for treating rifles and rocket launchers as if they were toys, earning Christopher a reputation for being reckless. For the Corwins, everyday life, far from their respective families, presented challenges that strained their relationship beyond the honeymoon phase. Their youth also meant they were not fully prepared for the challenges of marriage, often arguing over money and accusing each other of overspending. However, when Erin became pregnant, all disagreements and bitterness between her and Jonathan dissolved. She was so happy with the news that she announced it with a blue and pink post on her social media profile. Unfortunately, just a few weeks later, Erin suffered a miscarriage, which devastated her emotionally. To make matters worse, Jonathan's frequent deployments for military exercises far from the base added physical and emotional distance, as she felt he was unable to console her. Consequently, the cracks in their marriage not only reappeared, but also deepened. During the free time they shared, Christopher had been watching Erin and found it easy to discern the depth of sadness on her face. From that moment, he began spending more time with Erin without Nicole around. On a Sunday night in February 2014, the Lees joined the Corwins in their apartment. Jonathan and Nicole chose to watch a zombie series episode, but Erin, put off by the violence, declined to join. Instead of staying with his wife, Christopher went with Erin to the master bedroom to play video games. Alone, sitting side by side on the floor, they spent a few minutes in front of the screen until one of them paused the game and they looked at each other. Suddenly, they shared their first kiss. Although it lasted only a moment, that intimate gesture changed everything, and they began an affair that quickly escalated in intensity. Soon, Erin and Christopher were talking about leaving their spouses and how great a stepmother she would be to Liberty, whom she frequently cared for. Meanwhile, Nicole sensed her husband's growing distance and soon checked his cell phone, discovering the text messages between Christopher and Erin. Nicole was furious and confronted Christopher with a monologue filled with bitter words that lasted for hours. She didn't stop there, though. She also informed Jonathan about the affair, causing a heated confrontation that lasted through the night. When Erin tried to leave, Nicole, eyes blazing with rage, screamed threats at her. Aaron and Christopher ended their affair, but weeks later, they resumed their secret meetings. Around this time, Christopher wrote Aaron a poem, urging her not to give up. Meanwhile, unaware of the ongoing betrayal, Jonathan was determined to make his marriage work. Then, on June 22, 2014, as Erin anxiously awaited her mother's first visit to California, she discovered she was pregnant again, this time undoubtedly with Christopher's child. Though she didn't announce it on social media, she told him. Initially, Christopher feigned happiness, but in reality he was displeased, fearing the news could disrupt his plans. Despite promising a future together to Erin, Christopher had no intention of leaving his wife and was greatly fearful of Nicole's potential reaction to the pregnancy. His time in the Marines was nearing its end. On July 4, 2014, he was scheduled to finish his service and then planned to return to Alaska with his wife, leaving behind the tumultuous affair. The next day, Christopher told Isabel that he had been exploring the desert and was thrilled about the interesting things he had found, particularly excited about discovering a hard-to-reach mine shaft. He then asked to borrow a white propane tank that she owned. Isabel had no objections. Meanwhile, he started researching online how to dispose of a body. Then, he messaged Erin to invite her for a surprise romantic evening in the national park. Filled with excitement, Erin immediately texted a friend in Tennessee to share the news. They speculated about the true intentions of her lover and the mention of a surprise element. When her friend sent a text with a ring emoji, Erin admitted she was excited about the possibility of a marriage proposal. The date was set for June 28th. Christopher told his wife he had planned a coyote hunting trip in Joshua Tree National Park with Connor, which conveniently allowed him to take his Winchester .22 caliber rifle. Early that day, he also loaded up the propane tank and gasoline. Before leaving, he mentioned to Nicole that Connor had canceled so he would go alone. Around 7:30 that morning, Erin told Jonathan she was heading to Joshua Tree National Park to explore the trails that she and her mother could later bike on. She kissed him goodbye and said she loved him, leading her husband to believe that their life was returning to normal. Once at the meeting point, Erin faced a harsh disillusionment. Not only was there no dream marriage proposal, but Christopher also made it clear that he had no affection for her whatsoever. She was confronted with a man consumed by anger, with her as the target of his rage. What happened next is largely known only to him, but it is known that he fired shots into the air before using a rope tied to 2 reinforcement bars to strangle Erin, cutting off her air supply. After she fell to the ground, he checked her vital signs and, ensuring she was not breathing, threw her into the mine shaft he had discovered days earlier. Erin fell 76 meters deep. As hours passed with no news from his wife, Jonathan became anxious. He tried calling her at least 50 times and eventually reported her missing the next morning. When the young soldier also contacted his mother-in-law, she suspected that her daughter, who always had trouble with directions, might have gotten lost in the vast national park. Several days passed with no information about Erin's whereabouts. When new information finally emerged, it was far from reassuring. A woman living in a remote area noticed that a car had been parked near her house for several days, which was very unusual. She took pictures of the car and shared them, hoping the owner would appear. These photos turned out to be crucial, as it was discovered that the car belonged to Erin. When the police informed Erin's family that they had found her car abandoned several kilometers north of the park, she felt a stab in her heart. To her, it was almost a certain sign that her daughter had encountered something sinister. The police shared a similar sentiment. From that point, the authorities had two tasks, one more challenging than the other. The first task was to gather evidence to prosecute a potential attacker. In this regard, San Bernardino's detectives began to delve into Erin's life and soon uncovered hidden aspects that might have endangered her. It was through their investigations that Jonathan learned his wife's affair had continued in secret. This detail quickly led the police to rule out the husband as a suspect. Instead, Christopher became the focus of their investigation, especially after tire tracks found near Erin's car seemed to match his vehicle. Consequently, on July 1, 2014, Christopher was interviewed by the police. By then, he had hidden his rifle at Isabel's ranch. Christopher initially apologized for not disclosing his relationship with Erin, claiming their interactions had never crossed the boundaries set by their respective marriages. Then, unexpectedly, he claimed that Erin had confided in him about being a victim of domestic abuse. Regarding the Saturday she disappeared, he admitted being in the national park area alone, ostensibly to hunt coyotes, hence firing his gun at rocks. However, the police confronted him with the evidence, leading Christopher to change his story. Without a body, the investigators could not pressure him further. At that point, there was no way to prove Erin was deceased. So after 9 hours lacking sufficient evidence to charge him, the authorities had to let Christopher go. The police were convinced that the story provided by the main suspect was highly unusual and implausible. Later, when the detectives spoke with Nicole, they noted her uncooperative attitude, almost as if she resented the investigation. Christopher was eventually discharged from the Marine Corps, and as planned, he and his wife packed their bags, loaded their truck, and, along with Little Liberty, headed back to Alaska. Meanwhile, the police's second and more daunting task was to locate Erin's remains and prove that this was not a mere case of spontaneous disappearance. The investigation seemed to stall, and the detectives were frustrated. Until Isabel remembered that the week before Erin's disappearance, Christopher had mentioned going to the national park with a friend to explore mines, referencing one that nobody would find. Determined to follow this lead, they sought the help of a local expert, skilled and familiar with the scattered mines across the terrain. Guided by this expert, the investigators and volunteers in California began a meticulous search for Erin in the park. They covered 3,000 square kilometers of wilderness, with 6 different law enforcement agencies eventually getting involved. However, after several weeks of searching, there were no favorable results, leading to the difficult decision to end the operation on Saturday, August 16, 2014. Yet, in a surprising twist of fate on that day, a spelunker noticed a strong smell of gasoline coming from one of the mines. In the final hours of that day, volunteers lowered a bucket with a camera into the mine. At 9 meters down, the oxygen level in the pit was toxic, and further down, near 30 meters, they discovered what appeared to be a body. After a tremendous effort in the late hours of that Saturday in August, the body was retrieved, 2 months after Erin's disappearance. A propane tank was also found at the bottom of the mine, believed to be part of a failed attempt to destroy the victim's body. The remains were airlifted to the local morgue, where, due to advanced decomposition, dental records were used for identification. It was confirmed to be Erin, who had died from asphyxiation caused by an object still clutched around her neck. Additionally, it was revealed that she was pregnant. The shocking discovery that Erin and her unborn child had been killed sent her family on an emotional roller coaster. Though it was the worst possible news, for her mother at least, it was more bearable than the ongoing uncertainty of not knowing her whereabouts. For now, her mother only hoped that her daughter's body would be returned to Tennessee for a proper burial. With Christopher having the motive, means, and opportunity and evidence piling up against him, He was soon arrested by a police officer in Anchorage, and his vehicle was confiscated. Inside the car, beneath the passenger seat, authorities found a homemade object similar to the one found around Aaron's neck. This led the police to interview Christopher's mother. Although she knew nothing about the item and claimed never to have seen it, a search of her home later uncovered a magazine edition featuring an article on Aaron's case. Following Christopher's arrest, the case attracted national media attention. Shortly after, the San Bernardino's police held a press conference to provide details on the case. They mentioned that Christopher was the main suspect in the crime. They also searched Isabel's ranch, to her utter astonishment, where they found and seized a rifle owned by Christopher. Further complicating his situation, investigators discovered incriminating search histories on his internet activity. Consequently, Christopher was charged with first-degree murder. On Friday, September 19, 2014, hundreds of candles flickered in silent memory and tribute to Aaron and the unborn child whose life was cut short. Approximately 250 people attended the vigil, many wearing special T-shirts with Aaron's name on the front and a Bible verse on the back. During this time, Jonathan agreed to speak with only one media outlet among the many seeking his comment. In an interview, he expressed his hatred for Christopher's actions, but stated he felt that harboring hatred every time he saw him would eventually consume him. Jonathan revealed that he had learned about the rekindled affair and that his wife disappeared when she went to see Christopher, who was still his next-door neighbor. Part of him wanted to confront Christopher violently, but he refrained, believing it would make him no better than Christopher. Jonathan did not want to be a bad person. The legal process for obtaining justice for Aaron Corwin began 2 years later, in October 2016. From the outset of the trial against Christopher, the prosecution easily established his penchant for violence and his motive and opportunity to commit the crime. On Wednesday, October 19th, a forensic scientist testified that a .22 caliber bullet casing was found near the mine where Aaron's body was discovered, and the firing pin marks on the casing matched Christopher's gun. When it was the defense's turn, Christopher was presented as the sole witness. He took the stand and, despite confirming all evidence against him, confessed to killing Aaron. However, he then offered a narrative of the events that was clearly not only false but also desperate. He claimed he had suspected that Aaron had abused his daughter while caring for her, leading to a so-called revelation on that fateful Saturday in the desert. In light of his narrative, Christopher believed he had ample justification for his actions, clearly hoping that his macabre story would result in a lesser sentence. Throughout the trial, he maintained a demeanor of cooperation and calmness. However, the jury did not believe a single word of his account. After just 15 minutes of deliberation, Christopher Brandon Lee was found guilty of first-degree murder. The following month, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In response to the tragedy, Aaron's family and some civic groups advocated for a petition to the Bureau of Land Management, urging them to provide funding and resources to seal abandoned vertical mine shafts, starting with the one where Aaron Corwin perished. Recognizing the enormity of the task and acknowledging that some public areas had already been closed, they requested prioritization for this particular area to prevent similar tragedies from affecting other families. Reflecting on the entire ordeal and the relief of reaching a conclusive verdict, Aaron's mother admitted feeling emotionally and physically drained by the end of the sentencing hearing. She had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for over 2 years, with her grief so heavy that she could barely walk. Yet, following the verdict and sentencing, she felt an immense burden lifted off her shoulders, likening her emotional response to the day she finally adopted Aaron. She described years of uncertainty in the adoption process and how all the stress vanished the moment she gave Aaron her last name, mirroring her relief upon hearing Christopher's sentence. As for Jonathan Corwin, Aaron's husband, he chose to shield himself from media overexposure and was taking steps to rebuild his life after the tragic loss. With that, we conclude today's story. Remember to subscribe and like if you appreciate this work. Good night, and see you in the next episode of Unreal True Crime. It was November 2020 in a small town in Chile, and a 12-year-old girl named Melissa Chavez was sleeping peacefully. Melissa, known for her bright smile and strong spirit, had faced a lot of tough times in her life. That night, she finally fell asleep easily, feeling safe and comfortable in her bed. What she didn't know was that this night was different. It was quiet and calm, but something was not right. This would be her last night, and the quiet around her was hiding the sad truth that her days of playing and laughing were about to end. Melissa Chavez was born in 2008 in the city of Coquimbo, Chile. She was the youngest child of Mirta Ardil and Denny Chavez, who already had 3 children. Although Mirta and Denny were really nice people, the couple decided to separate shortly after Melissa's birth after 8 years together. However, Melissa's paternal family continued to stay in touch with her. Her aunt, Gina Chavez, had a special affection for her and was always concerned for her well-being. To support her household as a single mother, Mirta worked various jobs, including in a bar. It was there she became very close friends with Maria Teresa Caballero, a co-worker. Almost every night after closing the bar, Maria would head to another nearby bar to work extra hours and earn more money. Since Mirta often accompanied her wherever she went, she eventually found employment at that place as well. One night, while Mirta was working at the bar, a regular customer approached her. His name was Luis. Although details about his life are scarce, it is known he was born in 1981, worked in a mine in Antofagasta, and lived with his then partner. This first encounter led to a romance that neither Luis's ongoing relationship nor their age difference, with Mirta being 8 years his senior, could prevent. Eventually, Luis left his partner and moved in with Mirta. By the year 2010, when Melissa was just 2 years old. By this time, Melissa's reserved nature was already evident, a trait that did not change much as she grew older. When she started school, she was kind but clearly found it hard to socialize and had few friends. Her shyness extended towards Luis, whom she saw as a stranger. However, in 2012, when her mother and he welcomed their first child together, the new sibling helped Melissa to start accepting Luis into her life. From that point forward, he also took on a role in her upbringing, offering her affection and care as if she were his own daughter. In turn, she began to refer to him as her father. This dynamic continued for a while, allowing Melissa to experience something she had almost never had, a sense of a home without fractures. But in 2014, Luis's behavior towards her changed. Everything occurred one afternoon when he was looking after her while Mirta was at work. Just then, without warning, what had always been merely affectionate treatment turned into inappropriate touching. Melissa first confided in one of her older sisters and only afterward alerted her mother. Around the same time, the girl was seen by her school's psychologist, to whom she also revealed what had happened. Faced with the alarming disclosure and the need to act to protect the girl, the news was communicated to the school's principal. She reached out to Mirta, and knowing how serious the situation was, the psychologist and they went to talk to the authorities. A complaint was filed through the psychologist and the prosecutor's office. The prosecutor's office immediately opened a case, and as a result, the courts decided to revoke the mother's custody of her daughter. Initially, it was thought that temporary custody would be given to the biological father. However, at that time, his situation was far from ideal. On the contrary, he was suffering from deep depression and struggling with alcoholism. As such, Melissa was placed in the care of her Aunt Gina. As for Myrta, in October 2014, the same court referred her to a family court program. The goal was to subject her to psychological and psychiatric assessments. Last but not least, to regain custody of her daughter, she was required to separate from Luis. During the process, she assured the authorities that she had indeed left him. However, the reality was that she was still in contact with him secretly. After 17 months, in March 2016, following supposed new evaluations that concluded Myrta was capable of resuming personal care of her daughter, the Child Protection Agency of Coquimbo returned the custody to her. Once Melissa was back home with her, the woman also took Luis back. Not content with having the girl and the aggressor live under the same roof, Myrta went to the authorities to retract the complaints against him. Since then, the agencies closed the investigation and did not follow up on the case. Several years passed with no records of any irregular events. It's unknown whether they didn't occur or were hidden. Thus, when September 2020 arrived, Myrta and Luis moved with Melissa and her younger brother to a 2-story house. The idea was to rebuild their lives in a calmer environment. Melissa, who was 12 years old at the time, had started secondary school and was in the 7th grade. As her mother had noticed, she was becoming a more independent young lady, which was evident, for example, in her long stays alone in her room, almost always listening to music. Sleeping in was another thing she enjoyed. And while she occasionally complained that her mother was too strict and demanding, overall, Melissa seemed content in the new neighborhood. But just then, Luis sought to resume the inappropriate behavior towards her, which had been suspended after the whole ordeal caused by the initial complaint. This time, fully aware of what was happening, Myrta chose to pretend nothing was happening. She didn't even make a complaint to protect her daughter. Instead, she often felt really jealous because Luis paid more attention to Melissa. The morning of November 26, 2020 proceeded with complete normality as everyone prepared to leave the house. But before that, Luis entered the teenager's room and, unlike previous instances, completed the act in its entirety. After the abuse, he left Melissa lying on her bed, devoid of any desire to move, deeply sad and ashamed. Around 10:30 that morning, Luis and his son left the house and took a taxi they had ordered in advance through an app. The sequence was recorded by the area's security cameras. While they were going to a vaccination day at the Sun School in the city center, Myrta was losing the battle against her inner demons. Alone with her daughter at home, the woman took a knife from the kitchen and went upstairs to Melissa's bedroom. At that time, the girl had succumbed to sleep amidst tears and despair. Once in front of her, her mother attacked her, causing multiple injuries that left her agonizing. Then, Myrta sent text messages to her dentist to arrange an appointment. Afterward, she returned to Melissa's room and set fire to the lower part of the bed, where the young girl had already lost all signs of life. It was just after 11 a.m. when closed-circuit cameras recorded her leaving the home. After stopping at a store to withdraw money, Myrta took a taxi she had ordered and went to her dental appointment. Once again, her movements were captured by cameras. Barely 7 minutes after her departure, neighbors noticed smoke coming from the house and contacted emergency services. Meanwhile, Luis and his son, on their way back, saw the fire truck speeding past them. As they approached their home, Luis could see the firefighters struggling to control the flames engulfing his house. Shocked and incredulous, he called Mirta. She confirmed that she had left Melissa sleeping. Upon receiving this information, his distress was uncontrollable, so much so that he even tried to enter, but the authorities prevented him. Meanwhile, neighbors tried to offer support and calm him down. Once the team managed to partially control the fire, they identified that it had originated in one of the bedrooms. Upon entering, they found Melissa's lifeless body, which had not been completely consumed by the fire. Initially, rescuers suggested that smoke inhalation might have been the cause of her death. As for Mirta, she returned home, ready to pretend. Already notified of the tragedy, both she and Luis appeared devastated in front of the neighbors and the television cameras present. Unaware of the truth, Luis demanded justice, stating, "The person responsible, they're going to have to pay. They will have to pay for everything they did." Once Melissa's remains were transferred to the morgue, the investigation at the scene continued, and investigators collected some kitchen utensils and other items from the house for further analysis. Early findings led to the initial hypothesis of death by smoke inhalation being dismissed, and the possibility of third-party involvement began to gain traction. In the preliminary autopsy report, forensic experts noted that the body showed signs of blunt force trauma and puncture wounds. While the prosecutor requested to wait for the final results, the information somehow leaked, and soon, neighbors took to the streets demanding justice for Melissa and expressing their fear of a criminal loose in the area. After the forensic analyses were completed, and while waiting for the detailed and definitive report, Melissa's body was released to her family for the wake and subsequent burial. At the funeral, Mirta urged anyone with relevant information to cooperate in the search for the truth and clarification of the case. Visibly affected, Luis did the same. However, suspicions were directed at the victim's mother, especially considering she had been the last to leave the house on that fateful day. Others claimed to have seen an older man leaving just before the smoke was noticed. This last theory was convenient for Mirta, who clung to it. However, upon reviewing the security cameras around the house, investigators found no evidence of the alleged presence of this individual. Therefore, they decided to pause this line of inquiry while continuing to search for new clues. Meanwhile, since their involvement could not be entirely ruled out, Luis and Mirta were summoned as suspects. On that occasion, both repeated their version of events. Additionally, their cell phones were made available to the authorities. Shortly after, the autopsy results confirmed the severity of the attack Melissa suffered, which, according to forensic doctors, would not have been fatal had she received timely medical help. The detectives in charge of the case revealed chilling details, confirming she suffered cranioencephalic trauma and had 11 sharp force injuries. The worst part was that they estimated she had agonized for approximately an hour. Recent sexual abuse was also indicated by injuries, but no genetic material could be retrieved. From that moment, Luis became a focus for the prosecutor, who could not ignore the 2014 precedent. Meanwhile, chemical tests performed on the seized utensils found traces of the victim's and her mother's DNA, particularly on the knife used in the attack. The prosecutor's office revealed crucial details about this evidence. The knife used in the attack had a distinctive tip damage, matching the injuries and fractures on the teenager's skull. Moreover, it wasn't just that the mother's and daughter's DNA was found, but where it was located. According to the Legal Medical Service, Melissa's genetic material was on the blade, and a significant genetic fingerprint of Mirta was on the handle. Chemical tests also showed that after being used as a weapon, it was washed to remove blood traces. With all this evidence supporting a case beyond reasonable doubt, on February 2, 2021, Myrta was arrested as the alleged perpetrator of the crime. Later, the police provided details including their knowledge of the events. At the formalization hearing, the public prosecutor charged Myrta with the crime of homicide. After presenting a video that evidenced the chronology of the event, the prosecutor pointed out the absence of eyewitnesses, the mother's attempt to erase all evidence, and the short span between her departure and the smoke sighting. In summary, for the public prosecutor, it was a passionate and ferocious crime. Although the defense insisted on her innocence, the prosecutor dismissed the idea outright. During the investigation, Myrta was held in preventive detention for 6 months. However, the public prosecutor's office still needed to investigate the nature of the relationship between Luis and the minor. Aware of his precarious situation, Luis fled. Despite authorities' efforts to locate him, neither relatives nor friends had any information about his whereabouts. In parallel, a multitude of neighbors and family members expressed their condemnation of Myrta, demanding justice for Melissa, while the house became a symbol of commemoration and protest. Myrta's defense attorney challenged the decision to keep her detained during the investigation period. But on February 10th, the Court of Appeals confirmed the preventive detention measure against Myrta. One of the most affected was obviously Gina Melissa's paternal aunt. Amid her grief, she criticized the failures of a system that, in her opinion, did not adequately follow up with the family or verify that the mother was qualified to regain custody. She was particularly outraged that the authorities had not ensured Myrta and Luis's separation. Eventually, the various efforts to locate Luis yielded results on Wednesday, November 17, 2021, when he was discovered in the upper area of Coquimbo. He was handed over to justice, facing charges for repeated abuses of a minor. The next day, the defendant was made available to the Court of Guarantees. During the hearing, the prosecution presented further details of the crimes he had committed against Melissa. After hearing the arguments of the prosecution, ordered preventive detention for Luis and his admission to jail, arguing that releasing him posed a danger to society. Meanwhile, on November 29th, the prosecution formally charged Myrta and added a new charge for being an accomplice to the sexual crimes committed by her partner against her daughter. Nearly a year later, on September 23, 2022, the investigation's closing hearing took place. That day, the arguments of the parties to justify continuing the trial highlighted the testimonies of fellow inmates from the penitentiary where Myrta was held in preventive detention. They pointed out that Myrta dedicated all her time to taking care of her appearance and never showed remorse or sadness for how she had acted against her own daughter. They also presented a psychological profile of the accused, indicating to the court that she did not understand empathy but was very familiar with manipulation, as she had provided details and information from the beginning to distort her actions and divert suspicions that arose around her. They stated that Myrta was a person with a preserved reality judgment, aware of the illegality of her acts and the consequences of her actions. This made her culpable as she presented a personality disorder but no loss of contact with reality. Awaiting trial, the regional prosecutor announced he would request life imprisonment for Myrta. For Luis, he would seek a sentence of more than 20 years in prison. On January 21, 2023, just before the trial began, Myrta was urgently transferred from jail to the hospital due to complications from kidney stones. Her hospitalization became public through a photo leaked on social media, prompting criticism from the defense team for the lack of privacy for their client. 3 days after a successful operation, she was discharged and returned to prison. Given the extreme gravity of the events and the fact that they involved a minor, the Child Rights Defense Office requested that the hearings be conducted without media presence. During the last preparatory hearing for the trial, the defense attorney focused on the absence of genetic material to dismiss the accusations against Luis. Ultimately, considering the evidence presented by the public prosecutor's office insufficient, the court dismissed the charges, and instead of preventive detention, Luis was placed under house arrest with a prohibition on leaving the country. Despite this decision, he still had to face a trial. Mirta was not as fortunate. Despite her lawyer's efforts, the highest judicial authority determined she should remain in preventive detention. The trial for Melissa's case took place on April 23, 2023. Presenting a detailed chronology of the events leading to the tragic outcome, the prosecutor asserted that all evidence pointed unequivocally to Mirta, a woman whose jealousy led her to see a rival in her own daughter. To support her case, security camera footage was exhibited in court. The defense criticized what they considered a lack of thoroughness in the investigation, arguing that other leads that could have led to the real culprit and not Mirta were not sufficiently explored. The defense attorneys requested that the court consider their client's substantial cooperation since the beginning of the investigation, initially as witnesses and later as defendants. They proposed a sentence of 10 years for homicide and 5 for arson for Mirta, and a 3-year and 1-day prison sentence for Luis. However, both the public prosecutor and the case advocates opposed all the requests. On May 17, 2023, in a unanimous decision, the court found Luis and Mirta guilty of the charged crimes. Following the verdict, the prosecutors thanked the support of civil society and the entities involved in the investigation, including the experts from the forensic laboratory. On May 27, 2023, the court sentenced Mirta to 33 years in prison, 18 for homicide, and 15 for being the author of a consummated arson. Luis Santander was sentenced to 10 years and 1 day for repeated sexual abuse of Melissa Chavez and was prohibited from engaging in activities involving minors. The case deeply shocked Chilean society, and though the sentences could not reverse the irreparable loss of Melissa and the life she could have had, they brought some consolation to the community with the effective action of the judiciary. Dear viewers, this concludes today's story. Remember to subscribe and leave a like to let me know you appreciate my work. Good night. The Story of Stacy Panel. Stacy Pennell was born on September 5, 1967, in the small American town of Ripley, Mississippi. She had a younger brother and sister with whom she spent a lot of time and got along well with. Stacy was an energetic person with many friends. In school, she enjoyed participating in extracurricular activities. She joined the marching band, where she played a decorative wooden rifle. After graduating from high school in 1985, she attended Northeast Mississippi Community College in Boonville. Although it was about a 30-minute drive from her home, she decided to live in the dormitory. From the first days of college, Stacy was thrilled, made many friends, and joined the local marching band. On October 7, 1985, Stacy attended a training session after school, met up with her boyfriend, and went to a party on campus. At 12:30 a.m., she returned to the dormitory with her friends. They chatted for a bit, and then she went to sleep. At around 2:30 a.m., her roommate, Amy Wheeler, returned to the dormitory after the party but had lost her keys and had to knock on the door. The room was designed for 2 people, so only Stacy could open the door. However, there was no response to the knocking. Amy waited there for a few minutes before deciding to knock on the adjacent room's door. The dormitory was designed such that there was a common bathroom between the 2 rooms, so Amy could go through the bathroom of the adjacent room. A student named Stephanie Alexander lived in that room, who woke up to the knocking and opened the door. Both girls were surprised that Stacy did not respond to the knocking, so they entered her room together. The room was completely dark, and the only light came from a very dim lamp. Amy entered the room and saw Stacy lying on her bed, but one of her legs was hanging down, and she felt that something was not right with her friend. Getting closer, she was horrified to see blood on the bed. After recovering from the shock, she ran out of the room to get help. Other students responded to her screams, and the dormitory guard called 911. The police arrived and found an alarming scene. Stacy was dead, and there were traces of blood all over the room. There was a pillow over her face, and her underwear was pulled down. The investigators also noticed that someone had cut the mosquito netting of the window. Next to the bed, they found a wooden rifle that Stacy had used in parades with the marching band. It was covered in blood and wrapped in a towel. The police assumed the rifle had been used in the murder. Upon examining the crime scene more closely, forensic experts found a short hair on the victim's bed. All this was enough to form a preliminary picture of what had happened. Someone had made a hole in the window of Stacy's room, climbed in, raped, and murdered her. However, this version of events quickly revealed some inconsistencies. The size of the hole in the mosquito netting was too small for an adult to pass through. The window in question was situated at a certain height from the ground, which would have made the perpetrator's task more difficult. The police did not find the cut piece of the mosquito netting either. Furthermore, forensic experts examined the victim's body and found no traces of male biological material, casting doubt on the theory that the victim had been raped. At the same time, the pathologist confirmed that the wooden rifle, with a high degree of probability, was the murder weapon, as the injury characteristics indicated that the victim had been struck multiple times with it. Experts also did not find any defensive wounds on her body, suggesting that the victim did not resist the attacker. All possible evidence from Stacy's room was collected by crime scene investigators, but none of it furthered the investigation. At the time, DNA analysis was not commonly used, so the investigators could not examine the blood samples or other potential biological traces. Additionally, no fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, as the perpetrator had apparently wiped it clean with the towel. Despite the lack of leads, detectives still hoped that experts might find something in the room, so they decided to take fingerprints from all individuals who theoretically could have entered the women's dormitory. This task proved to be very difficult, as the police had to speak with hundreds of male university students and ask them to volunteer their fingerprints. They also took prints from all male staff members. The problem was that only girls lived in this residence, and a special key was needed to enter the building. Men could only enter in a few instances, such as being let in by residents or being college employees with a key. Nevertheless, the female residents frequently invited their boyfriends and male friends, which meant that the officers had to spend a lot of time collecting their fingerprints. However, in the end, this led to no results since no matching prints were found at the crime scene. With no leads, the investigators turned to a psychologist and asked for a psychological profile of the killer. After reviewing all the available information, The specialist posited that the attacker was likely a man between 20 and 24 years old with a strong physical build and no criminal record. The psychologist believed that the crime was not premeditated. The killer saw an opportunity and decided to attack the victim. This description made the officers further doubt that the criminal had entered the room through the window, as the hole in the mosquito netting was too small for a large, adult man to pass through. Meanwhile, panic spread among the college students. The female students were afraid to be in their residences, fearing they could become the next victim of the unknown assailant. The fact that the police could not find any clues only heightened the overall anxiety. The officers continued to search for possible suspects and decided to investigate Stacy's boyfriend, Tommy Osborne. They searched his room in the residence and found nothing to suggest his involvement. Investigators found it impossible to establish whether Stacy Pannell's boyfriend, Tommy Osborne, had any motive for her murder. According to Stacy's friends, the couple rarely argued and had no significant issues. However, the investigators learned from Stacy's parents that before starting college, she had another boyfriend named Ben with whom she had broken up just a few months earlier. Ben and Stacy had been in a long-term relationship during school, and he had even given her a ring, hoping to marry her in the future. But Stacy ended the relationship, and despite Ben's reluctance to accept the breakup and his refusal to take the ring back, Stacy did not change her decision. Up until Stacy left for college, Ben repeatedly tried to meet with her, but she remained firm in her decision. The detective spoke with Ben, who claimed that on the night of the murder, he was asleep at home. His mother corroborated his alibi, stating that he went to bed around 11 p.m. and was home the next morning. However, the investigators considered the possibility that Ben could have left the house undetected, gone to Stacy's college, committed the murder, and then returned home. Ben agreed to undergo a polygraph test, but the results were inconclusive. The operator could not determine if he was telling the truth. A second interrogation yielded the same results. This made the detectives suspicious, but without concrete evidence, they could not link him to the crime. Experts attempted to determine if the hair found on Stacy's bed belonged to Ben, but they were unable to reach a definitive conclusion. Since DNA analysis was not commonly used at that time to confirm or refute such evidence, it was not possible to do so. Due to the uncertain polygraph results, Ben became the prime suspect in the case, but Stacy's relatives did not believe he was capable of harming her. They described him as kind and well-mannered, always taking care of her. However, without evidence, the police could not charge him, and the search for clues continued. Later on, the investigators re-examined the case materials and noticed something peculiar. When examining the cut in the mosquito netting, they observed that the fibers were directed towards the outside rather than inside, indicating that the piece had been cut from within Stacy's room, not from outside. This discovery further puzzled the detectives. If the killer did not enter through the window, he must have had a key or entered with one of the residents. However, the police doubted this was possible since there was a guard in the dormitory who sat near the entrance and watched everyone who came in and out. For several months, there were no significant developments in the case. Then, the lead detective decided to seek assistance from Steve Rhodes, the sheriff of Illinois, who was well known in law enforcement circles for his unique approach to interrogations based on neuro-linguistic programming. He frequently spoke at police seminars and had a reputation for being able to extract information from almost any suspect and detect lies. Steve agreed to interrogate 4 people involved in the case: Stacy's neighbors Amy and Stephanie, as well as Ben and Tommy. In September 1986, he began his work, starting with Amy. She recounted everything she knew, and the officer found no reason to doubt her words. He then spoke with Stephanie, who said that on the night in question, she took an anti-inflammatory medication prescribed by a doctor and went to sleep. At around 12:30 a.m., Stephanie heard Stacy and her friends returning to the dormitory and talking loudly in Stacy's room. Stephanie went to ask them to speak more quietly. After her request, Stacy's friends left for their rooms, and Stephanie went to bed. However, Steve Rhodes, an experienced investigator, sensed that Stephanie was withholding important details. He accused her of lying and urged her to tell the truth. Despite Stephanie's insistence that she was not deceiving him, Rhodes continued to press her with questions until she finally revealed that she had returned to Stacy's room after the friends had left. This was a shocking development for the detectives, nearly a year after the murder. After a long pause during the questioning, Stephanie, to everyone's surprise, confessed that she had killed Stacy. According to Stephanie, she had entered Stacy's room for a chat. At some point, the conversation turned to Tommy Osborne, Stacy's boyfriend. Stephanie complimented Tommy, which upset Stacy. When Stacy demanded that Stephanie stay away from Tommy, the conversation escalated. After an exchange of words, Stacy slapped Stephanie, who retaliated in kind. The altercation became physical, and at some point Stephanie grabbed a wooden rifle next to the bed and struck Stacy, causing her to fall onto the bed. Stephanie then hit Stacy several times more until she stopped moving. Realizing what she had done after seeing the blood, Stephanie panicked and decided to dispose of the evidence. She locked the bedroom door, washed the blood off her hands, and then staged the scene to make it look as if someone had broken into the room, raped, and killed Stacy. She placed a pillow over Stacy's head, pulled down her underwear, and then cut a hole in the mosquito netting, hiding it in Stacy's closet under a pile of clothes. She cleaned the wooden rifle with a towel and took a shower to remove any traces of blood. Stephanie then decided to get rid of her t-shirt and the piece of mosquito netting she had cut. She locked herself in the bathroom and burned them to mask the smell of smoke by spraying a large amount of perfume. After covering her tracks, Stephanie went to bed and was only awakened when Amy knocked on her door. The detectives were astonished by this confession. For a whole year, it had never occurred to them that the killer could be a woman, let alone Stacy's dormitory neighbor. Stephanie was arrested and charged with Stacy's murder. 3 days later, she wrote a letter to her boyfriend, whom she had been dating for a week at the university, detailing the events and claiming it was an accident. She wrote that on the day of the murder, she had taken some energy pills and was not thinking clearly. She didn't even remember the moment of the murder, but had seen it in nightmares throughout the year. Days after sending the letter, the case took another unexpected turn. Stephanie claimed that Steve Rhodes had put her in some sort of trance using his techniques and had implanted the confession in her mind. She insisted she couldn't have killed Stacy and accused the police of taking advantage of her vulnerable state to close the case. According to her, the energy pills clouded her mind, allowing Steve Rhodes to convince her over time that she had indeed killed her neighbor. In 1987, a judge held 3-day hearings to determine the truth of her statements. The detectives asserted that Stephanie had not been subjected to any undue pressure and that no one had hypnotized her. They argued that in her confession, she mentioned details only the murderer could know, such as where she hid the knife used to cut the mosquito netting. The detectives hadn't found it during their initial investigation, but after Stephanie's confession, they found the knife in the closet under a pile of clothes. However, there were nuances. Firstly, the girls were neighbors and often entered each other's rooms, so Stephanie might have known about the knife's location under different circumstances. Secondly, no evidence could confirm or refute that the net had been cut with that specific knife. Nonetheless, the judge concluded that Stephanie's initial testimony was not obtained through hypnosis or any other form of manipulation. The trial began in 1988. Stephanie's lawyers continued to argue that her confession was coerced and highlighted the lack of evidence against their client. They emphasized that the lie detection tactics used by Steve Rhodes were not scientifically founded and could not be used in court according to the law. Rhodes claimed that one could tell if someone was lying by observing their eye movements. Furthermore, Stephanie's lawyers presented medical examination results indicating that her cognitive abilities could have been impaired due to the energy pills, making her more susceptible to manipulation like hypnosis. The prosecution argued that Stephanie knew details unknown to investigators at the time of the interrogation, making her testimony credible. They also conducted a court experiment with a psychological sciences doctor attempting to hypnotize her, concluding that it was not possible to induce such a state in her. The victim's relatives also shared interesting information, stating that Steve Rhodes had mentioned Stephanie several times, considering her a problematic person and to some extent fearing her. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury eventually found Stephanie guilty of involuntary manslaughter, sentencing her to 20 years in prison, of which she served 9 before being released on parole. Once freed, Stephanie continued to maintain her innocence and hired lawyers to revisit the case. During their review, the lawyers noticed similarities with another murder committed in 1993. At that time, a man named Charles Crawford attacked a girl who lived 40 minutes away by car from the college Stacy Pannell attended. There were some notable similarities between these two cases. Firstly, the other victim also attended Northeast Mississippi Community College in Boonville. Secondly, the perpetrator entered her home by cutting a hole in the mosquito netting. Stephanie and her lawyers believed that Charles Crawford could be behind Stacy's murder. Crawford was arrested in 1993 and subsequently sentenced to death. The challenge lies in the lack of evidence to prove his guilt in Stacy's case. However, there were significant developments. Stephanie's lawyers discovered that on the wooden rifle found at the crime scene, there was a drop of blood that did not belong to Stacy. DNA analysis of this evidence had not been carried out at the time, as a case review was necessary to proceed with it. Additionally, the victim's underwear was sent to an independent expert, and they were able to extract a DNA sample from an unknown male. This sample has not been added to the FBI's database for comparison with Crawford's DNA because a case review is required for that as well. Moreover, there is no guarantee that the sample found is related to the murder. Supporting the possibility of Crawford's involvement, the lawyers pointed out other facts. Crawford lived near the college at that time, and allegedly 2 witnesses saw him near the campus a few days before the murder. However, there is no reliable confirmation of this sighting. Despite similarities between the 2 crimes, there are discrepancies. The cut in the mosquito netting was made from inside the room to the outside, which discounts the possibility of an intruder entering from the street. Additionally, Crawford's height was 6 feet and 1 inch, making it unlikely that he could fit through such a small opening. Another contentious point is that the murderer used Stacy's wooden rifle as a weapon. If Crawford had really decided to enter the victim's room and kill her, it is hard to imagine that he would not have brought a weapon with him. Currently, Stephanie and her lawyers are still trying to obtain a case review that would allow comparison of the evidence with Crawford's DNA. Crawford remains on death row, having even spoken with detectives about Stacy's case, but the police could not determine if he was near the college on the night of the murder. You've just witnessed another unfolding story in Unreal True Crime. Lock in your support by subscribing and turning on notifications. Your insight could open the next story. Have a good day. Raheem Taylor, 58 years old, was the 5th execution of 2023, following a previous execution in Missouri, 2 in Texas, and 1 in Oklahoma. All were by lethal injection. Taylor kicked his feet as the 5 grams of pentobarbital were administered, then took 5 or 6 deep breaths before all movement stopped. In a final statement, Taylor said, "Muslims don't die, but live eternally in the hearts of our family and friends. Death is not your enemy. It is your destiny. Look forward to meeting it. Peace." Leonard Taylor was born in the United States in the mid-1960s. He was the son of Jesse, who also had another son identified as Perry Taylor. In the late 1980s, Leonard met a girl named Mia Perry, with whom he became romantically involved. Around this time, Leonard began to accumulate a criminal record. Initially, he was convicted on charges related to narcotics and concealed weapons in San Bernardino County and spent time behind bars, though the length of his sentence remains unclear. In September 1990, a 19-year-old man was fatally attacked following an argument in an apartment complex located in the same county. By then, Leonard, who had been released, was living in that area. Due to his criminal record, he became one of the primary suspects in the case, but managed to avoid any responsibility. As part of his scheme to evade justice, he used a false name, Michael Chambers. The following year, in 1991, Mia became pregnant. The news of his first child did not motivate Leonard to change his ways. During this time, he was arrested by the Drug Enforcement Administration and convicted for transporting and selling narcotics, leading to his incarceration in a federal prison. Since his daughter was born amid these circumstances, he was unable to be present with Mia during the birth. Facing reality, Mia named the baby on her own and prepared to raise her child independently. Soon after, what people thought became true. Leonard's connection seemed less likely with his newborn when, in 1992, he was found guilty of statutory rape and child abuse in San Diego County. While in prison, he disclosed to a local media outlet that he maintained connections with some scammers involved in irregularities related to corporate check frauds. Upon his release, Leonard embarked on a short-lived career in white-collar crime, which quickly returned him to jail, this time in the Missouri State Prison. The San Bernardino police arrested him again in 1999 for failing to register as a sex offender. Shortly after the beginning of the 2000s, Leonard was accused again, this time for intimate coercion against a minor. Aside from his illicit businesses, which required him to travel across the country, he maintained relationships and intimacy with multiple women simultaneously, earning him the nickname CAs, short for Casanova. Another standout trait of his criminal behavior was making and using fake IDs in different names, ending up with almost 20 of them at some unknown time. Leonard married a woman living in California who also had an outstanding arrest warrant for a probation violation. It was during this time, under unspecified circumstances, that Leonard met Angela Rowe. Their first encounter took place in the city of Jennings, in St. Louis County, Missouri. Angela was born around 1976. She had previously been in a romantic relationship with a man with whom she had other children, Alexis Conley, Acrea Conley, and Tyrese Conley. Despite being married and also being involved with another woman in Kentucky, Leonard began a relationship with Angela. After a rather brief period, he moved into her house located in the suburbs of St. Louis. Angela's home was well known among the neighbors for the constant joy radiated by her 3 young residents. From then on, Angela's house and her children also became the love nest for the new couple. By the end of 2004, Leonard and Angela had been living together for approximately a year, and according to her family and friends, their cohabitation was not without its challenges and difficulties. On Saturday, November 20th, 2004, a friend called Angela and asked to borrow $50. At that time of year, the traditional holiday season was approaching. Being a mother of 3 children, Christmas was particularly important. Therefore, Angela later took the time to decorate the house with her children, hanging large and striking candy canes at the entrance and placing lights to add to the festivity. That weekend, the kids went to celebrate Thanksgiving early with Tyrone, their father, and his side of the family. Meanwhile, on Sunday, November 21st, Angela did not show up for her weekend shift as a housekeeper, but called to inform she would not be able to come. The following day, a friend called her, and they chatted as usual. The children returned to their mother's house and were seen by some neighbors in the following days. From that weekend in November 2004, several significant events occurred, yet the how and when of the detailed events were something the authorities could never fully reconstruct. However, everything points to an argument between Leonard and Angela, during which she threatened him with a knife. He then overpowered her and shot her. In a turn of events, realizing that the kids had witnessed everything, Leonard took the lives of all 3 children. Afterwards, he turned off the heating and instead turned on the central air conditioning of the house. According to phone records, on November 23, 2004 at 11:24 p.m., Leonard called his brother Perry to ask for money. It is believed that during their conversation, he confessed to what had happened, adding that things had gotten out of control and that it wasn't what he wanted, but it happened. On the same day, Angela's friend called the house phone repeatedly without getting an answer. A few hours later, at 12:05 p.m. on Wednesday, November 24th, she tried again without success. Between that day and the next, Perry told his girlfriend about what Leonard had done. On Thursday, November 25th, while most American households were finalizing details to celebrate Thanksgiving, Perry went to his girlfriend's house. There, his brother contacted him again. After the conversation, Perry told the girl that Leonard was still in Angela's house, waiting for a letter from California. There were 3 more calls in the following hours, one of which was specifically made from the landline of Angela's house. It was during one of these conversations that Perry's girlfriend heard him ask Leonard how he was still there, specifically alluding to the presence of the bodies. What Leonard's response was remains unknown. Then, a plane ticket from St. Louis to California was booked, with the transaction being made from a phone number with a California area code. Early in the morning of Friday, November 26th, Leonard went to his sister-in-law's house so she could take him to the airport. He had plane tickets from St. Louis to Ontario, California, via Phoenix, Arizona. The ticket was in the name of Louis Bradley, an alias that Leonard used and for which he had a Missouri ID that included his photo. He took the opportunity of being at his sister-in-law's house to leave a box that was to be delivered to his brother. Shortly after, according to some witnesses, he was seen disposing of a gun in a sewer near Perry's girlfriend's house, but the weapon was never recovered. On the way to the airport, Leonard told his sister-in-law that this would probably be the last time she would see him alive. Then, to elaborate on this strange notion, he added that some people were trying to kill him and that she should not pay attention to things she might hear about him. Cameras recorded Leonard that Friday morning passing through the security area at St. Louis International Airport. He was wearing dark pants, a pink shirt, and a cream-colored hat, carrying 2 black bags. Shortly after, he headed to Gate 16 to catch the 8:10 Southwest Airlines flight to Ontario. Meanwhile, Angela's friend continued calling throughout those days until November 27th, never receiving a response. On the other side of the country, between Saturday and Sunday, Leonard finally met up with his wife. During this time, Angela's absence was noted by her co-workers, but unlike previous occasions, there was no call from her to report anything. Leonard stayed in San Bernardino County for 4 days before driving across the country with a friend. He traveled through Texas, Louisiana, and Georgia, ending up in a house in Kentucky. For the week of November 29th, when classes resumed after the Thanksgiving holiday, the absence of Angela's kids at school did not go unnoticed. Then, with considerable concern over Angela's prolonged silence, her family asked the police to check on the woman and her 3 children. Thus, on December 3, 2004, police officers were sent to the small brick house in the suburbs of St. Louis. Once on site, the officers found several significant details, including that the front door was locked, newspapers were piled up in the front yard, and mail overflowed the mailbox. The team managed to enter through a bedroom window. The air conditioning was running at full power outside while the television was on. The next thing the agents had to face was far from an idyllic home scene. Wrapped in blankets, Angela was found lifeless, likely from gunshot wounds. Her 3 young children also appeared to have suffered fatal gunshot wounds, and their bodies were aligned on a bed in the early stages of decomposition. The coroner found out that the victims had passed away 2 or 3 days before their bodies got stiff. Meanwhile, during subsequent thorough investigations at the residence, investigators found 2 non-functional cell phones, and there was no evidence that Angela had any other cell phone in use besides her own. As often happens in such cases, Leonard was immediately considered the main suspect. This was initially due to his relationship with Angela, but it is fair to say that his extensive criminal history also raised suspicions. As the police tracked his whereabouts, Perry was interrogated about the accusations against his brother on December 8, 2004. During that interview, Perry told detectives that Leonard had called him and admitted to his actions. After an intense nationwide chase, police monitored a house in Madisonville, Kentucky, where Leonard was staying. On December 9th, Leonard tried to flee by hiding on the floor of a vehicle and was arrested on the spot, holding a knife in his hand and moving under the alias of Jason. Beyond that, he made no moves nor uttered any comments. The sunglasses Leonard wore at the time of his arrest, along with a few other belongings, were taken as evidence, although nothing seemed to suggest that these objects could provide any clues. Later, the police made some statements about the arrest. According to the detective in charge, Leonard's wife was not much help in the investigation. Authorities believed Leonard had turned to her for money to facilitate his escape. While the only suspect was finally in custody, the funeral services for Angela and her kids were held in Missouri. Standing beside his oldest daughter's coffin, Tyrone could not help but break down. Leonard maintained his innocence throughout, and indeed, his defense focused on the fact that he was in California when the bodies were discovered. His case was also based on the probable date of death stated by the coroner. However, the suspicions for the 4 deaths were only part of his legal troubles. Thus, while awaiting the resolution of the case, in April 2005, Leonard began serving a 100-year sentence for an unrelated conviction. 5 months later, he filed a request for the state to notify him if there was any intention to use DNA evidence in the case involving Angela and her 3 children, and if so, what type it would be, and whether physical evidence had been presented for analysis or examination. On May 25, 2006, Leonard filed a motion requesting the return of his personal belongings, including the sunglasses he wore when arrested. But in August 2006, the state took possession of the glasses and other evidence that were in police custody, and 3 months later, in November, all items were taken to the forensic lab for analysis. There, experts conducted a specialized test, which is used to determine the possible presence of blood. The procedure yielded a positive result for the presence of blood on the nose pad of the sunglasses, but there was a complication since the sample was very small. For this reason, a second confirmation test to detect the presence of DNA was not performed. Between the end of that year and the beginning of 2007, the stain was subjected to DNA testing, but due to its size, the professional in charge could not obtain a complete genetic profile. What was obtained from the partial genetic profile excluded Angela's children. However, the presence of her DNA could not be ruled out from the study. Specifically, the result had a probability of matching 1 in every 12,300 people belonging to the African American population. In May 2007, Leonard filed a motion to exclude the results of these tests as evidence in the trial. A hearing was held where the state explained that the reports were disclosed as soon as they were received, and that, contrary to what Leonard suggested, the evidence was not deliberately hidden. Ultimately, the trial court rejected his request. In January 2008, Leonard again insisted on the same point by filing a new motion to exclude any evidence related to the specialized test. Another hearing took place, and the court overruled Leonard's objection, thus admitting the validity of the results as evidence of the presumed presence of blood. During the trial that year, Leonard objected to the admission of this evidence but again faced a setback when the trial court dismissed his objections. However, the forensic scientist who conducted the tests testified that the test is presumptive because it can also yield a positive reaction to substances like potatoes, rust, bleach, and nickel. He also emphasized that since there was no confirmatory examination, the substance on the glasses was only possibly blood. Leonard did not testify at his trial. However, the coroner did testify, and his testimony marked a significant turn in the case, as he stated that the deaths could have occurred 2 or 3 weeks before the officers visited the house. This detail firmly placed the incident before Leonard's departure to California. He also explained that he had not initially considered the detail that the air conditioning thermostat was set to the maximum cold setting. When the state called Perry as a witness, the case seemed to turn again, especially when asked about his statement during the police interrogation, where he said that Leonard had confessed to the acts. He said he did not remember anything that happened and went even further to claim that his statements to the police had been the result of coercion by the authorities. After hearing from the various witnesses, it was time for the closing arguments. The state, represented by the prosecution, emphasized that the blood sample found on the man's sunglasses was indeed Angela's. In this sense, it was recalled that scientific evidence does not need to be conclusive to be admissible. Indeed, while some states require it to be so, other states have held that presumptive blood tests are admissible as long as they are accurately described, achieving their purpose of being useful to the jury. After deliberating for 4.5 hours, the jury found Leonard Taylor guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of armed criminal action. But there is something particular about his sentencing. Although it has not been possible to determine when and how, it seems that during his time in prison, Leonard converted to Islam, even changing his name to Rahim. Thus, during the sentencing hearing, also known as the penalty phase, he prohibited his defense team from presenting witnesses. Instead, he stated he was Muslim and expressed to the judge that Allah, not the court, would determine his fate. The state presented evidence, including Leonard's previous convictions. Testimony was also offered from a victim who was forced by Leonard to have intimacy and 3 members of Angela's family. The jury found 5 aggravating factors for each victim, among them mental provocation, which made the acts considered outrageously vile, horrendous, and inhumane, thereby exhibiting cruelty and disdain for the sanctity of all human life. Consequently, Leonard was sentenced to capital punishment. The execution by lethal injection was scheduled for February 7, 2023, at a Missouri prison. The case attracted the attention of several groups dedicated to defending Leonard's innocence and, therefore, demanding a review and commutation of the sentence. However, the man's claims of innocence were rejected time and again. In response to some of the appeals, the Missouri Attorney General's office stated that the case against him was solid. Perry, Leonard's brother, died in 2015. In January 2023, as the execution date loomed, Leonard's attorneys requested a hearing on their client's claim of innocence. They were supported by a provision in Missouri law which allows a prosecutor to file a motion for a hearing before a judge in case of new evidence of a wrongful conviction. Firstly, Leonard's defense team proposed a theory about an alternative perpetrator. After a drug deal went wrong, Leonard thought he would be targeted for murder, so he quickly left town. However, the traffickers showed up at Angela's house, and failing to find him or the illicit substances they believed were hidden there, they unleashed their fury on her and her 3 young children. Secondly, the defense team obtained statements from Leonard's daughter and from Mia, her mother. Both stated that he was in California at the end of November 2004, and according to the lawyers, he could not have been the perpetrator of the crimes. These documents were subsequently presented to the Conviction Review Unit within the prosecutor's office. The following month, just hours before the execution, St. Louis County prosecutor rejected the request for a hearing before a judge, stating that the facts did not support a credible case of innocence. Concurrently, the governor refused to grant a pardon, and the United States Supreme Court also declined to intervene. Finally, on Tuesday, February 7, 2023, in the evening, everything was arranged to carry out the procedure. In his final statement, Leonard said that Muslims do not die, but live eternally in the hearts of family and friends. Taylor kicked his feet as the 5 grams of pentobarbital were administered, then took 5 or 6 deep breaths before all movement stopped. And that's the case for today. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. See you soon.